The body's nervous system includes the brain, spinal cord, and all the nerves throughout the body, and the nervous system consists of hundreds of billions of cells that are divided into two categories, neurons and glial cells or glia. The glia help to support the neurons, which are the primary cells that do the communicating. Nervous system is a communication system, and neurons send signals and receive signals. They do this working in teams or groups called neural networks. There are many different types of neurons throughout the nervous system, but they all work primarily the same way. The neuron sends electrical signals from one end to the other, and then sends a chemical signal from one neuron to another neuron, or from one neuron to a muscle, for example. The signal that goes through the neuron from one end to the other is called an action potential, an electrical signal. The electrical activity that is going on in the neurons in the brain can be measured by a machine called an EEG, and the electrical waves are known as brain waves. One of the first scientists to study neurons was Spanish neuroscientist Santiago Ramon y Cajal, who didn't know what neurons did exactly, but he knew they were important. He made beautiful drawings of them, and he called them the butterflies of the soul. Here are the basic components of a neuron. A neuron is a cell, so it has a cell body, which is called a soma, and that cell body has a center called the nucleus, where all kinds of important biological stuff is happening. Growing out of the cell body are branches called dendrites. Their job is to receive signals, sometimes from other neurons, sometimes from the outside world, like in your eyes or in your ears or your nose. And then the cell body has a long branch called an axon that will carry the signal from one place to another. So, for example, if a bee stings you on the toe, an electrical signal will be created, and it will be carried up axons that go up your leg to your spinal cord. And in your spinal cord, the neuron will send the signal to another neuron. That's called the synapse, and that is a chemical message that is sent. But in the axon, what we call axonal transmission, the message that travels through the axon from one end to the other, is called an action potential, and that is an electrical signal. Here is another illustration that shows the major components of a neuron. A signal starts at the dendrites. They receive the signal. They create an electrical charge, positive charge that ends on the inside of the neuron, and that travels down the axon all the way to the end, what we call terminal buttons. The axon often is coated with a white fatty substance that is called myelin, and this coating along the axon is called a myelin sheath. But don't take the name sheath literally, because there are little openings in the myelin where that are important, because that's where positively charged particles can enter the axon. The way a signal travels from one end of a neuron to the other is that the dendrites have chemicals called receptors that receive the information. A chemical reaction occurs that causes little channels to open up on the neuron that allow sodium ions to enter the axon, and this causes the signal to travel all the way down to the end. That is called an action potential, or we say that the neuron is firing. The dendrites of a neuron have chemicals on them that are called receptors. They receive information. For example, they receive light coming into your eyes, or they receive chemicals from other neurons, and that causes a chemical reaction in the dendrites, which opens up some channels on the cell body of the neuron, and those channels allow certain electrically charged particles to enter the cell. The main particles that are involved are sodium ions, positively charged particles that are floating around in the water in your body. And these positively charged particles enter the neuron, and that can cause a signal to be sent from one end to the other. If a neuron is coated with myelin, has a myelin sheath, then the signal can travel more efficiently, there'll be less crosstalk, and it will travel faster. So myelinated neurons are much better than unmyelinated. And as you see in this illustration at the top, we have a myelinated neuron that sends a signal very fast and efficiently compared to the unmyelinated neuron on the bottom. Sometimes diseases like multiple sclerosis, known as MS, destroy the myelin, and that causes a lot of problems. When a neuron fires, the positively charged signal travels all the way down to the end and then dumps out some chemicals at the synapse, and those chemicals will pass the signal on many other neurons. For example, an average neuron in your brain is sending signals to 1,000 other neurons. Here is an illustration that summarizes the idea of the action potential, or the firing of a neuron. The dendrites, the branches that grow out of the cell body, receive the signal and cause a chemical reaction that allows sodium ions to enter the cell. So the cell becomes more positively charged. And that positively charged signal travels all the way down the axon from the cell body to the end where the terminals are, that will then send the signal on to more neurons or to muscle in the body. Here's another illustration of an action potential. If you want, you could stop the video here and study this illustration. A neuron, when it is not firing, is more negatively charged on the inside and more positively charged on the outside. When a neuron fires, when there's an action potential, little channels open up and allow sodium ions, which are positively charged, to enter the inside of the neuron. This begins the process of the action potential. And here we see an illustration of the action potential. The inside of the neuron becomes more positively charged because of sodium ions entering the neuron. Why did they enter? Because there was a chemical reaction at the dendrites. And then that opens up ion channels next door, and then next door, and then next door. And so all the way down the axon at a rate of about 200 miles per hour, faster when it's myelinated. The sodium ions are entering, so a positive signal is being passed, for example, from your toe up to your spinal cord. When a bee stings you on the toe, zoom, an electrical signal goes up to your spinal cord where there's synapses that then pass chemical messages to other neurons. There are chemicals that can block the sodium channels on neurons and therefore block sodium from entering, and an action potential then cannot be created. One of these chemicals is novocain. Perhaps you've gone to the dentist and had a shot of novocain. That will block up temporarily the sodium channels, and so the sodium can't enter the neuron, and therefore no signals can be sent to the brain, and so you feel no pain, and you might even drool on yourself. That brings us to the end. I hope you enjoyed learning about the action potential. This is Psychology Professor Bruce Hinrichs. My channel is called Brucey. Please watch some more of my videos on psychology. Bye, everybody.